From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the African Middle East Division of the Library of Congress. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted to see you all for a program with the most intriguing title, The Woman Who Read Too Much. Reading too much here at the Library of Congress, is that possible? Bahiyyih Nakhjavani, about whom you will hear much more in a minute when she's introduced, is a scholar and a novelist who writes about a part of the world for which this division is responsible, the Persian-speaking world. As most of you already know, our division is made up of three sections: the African, the Near East section, and the Hebraic sections. We're responsible for materials from 78 countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as from the entire continent of Africa, North and Sub-Sahara. Our Hebraica and Judaica collections come from all over the world. We also serve these materials to patrons here in our reading room and organize programs, exhibits, conferences, and other activities that highlight these collections and that inform our patrons about the countries and the cultures these publications come from. Our presentation today is a case in point. It is a story and a history which Bahiyyist publishers describe as, quote, set in the world of the Qajar monarchs, mayors, ministers, and mullahs. It explores the dangerous and at the same time luminous legacy left by a remarkable woman. Bahiyyih Nakhjavani offers a gripping tale that is at once a compelling history of a pioneering woman, a story of 19th century Iran told from the street level up, and a work that is universally relevant to our times. And now, to introduce her is Hilal Dinavari, the Persian world specialist, and a scholar and a person who has organized the most wonderful exhibit on the Persian book, and I hope you all had a chance to see it last year. It was done on the occasion of Nowruz, and today, once again, we are celebrating, I think, the last day of Nowruz, and so welcome here and happy Nowruz. And this is Hilal now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Jane. Again, I want to thank everyone for coming in today, especially since it is the 13th, Sis Dabedar, and usually people go out picnicking. So it's an honor to have you here. I also wanted to bring, mention that today is also, we're getting close to the beginning of Pesach, of the starting of Passover, and also Easter. So all the holidays are coming together, and it's a wonderful period and season of the year. As Mary Jane had mentioned, we had this lovely exhibition last year, which had 13 lectures that went with it. The lecture series will continue this year. We are having 6 lectures that have to do with philosophy. It's still on the Persian book, but this year's focus is philosophy. But in between, we also have a series of other lectures that we conduct as part of our noontime Near East section lectures. We are very proud today to have one of our noontime lectures featuring a very dynamic personality who, no matter how hard I try to explain or try to give her biography, I will not do her justice. Well, she's a professor of English, but she's also a creative writer. And it so happens that I found out today that she is related to the famous Dr. Banani, who passed away a few years ago, a great personality of Persian literature that I had met at UCLA, and a personality in the Baha'i community. He has done amazing work on the famous woman poetess, Tahirih, who this novel that you're going to hear about is based on her life. She, in many ways, was the first Iranian woman to speak out in the late 18th century, 19th century, and unveil, and has become canonized in the Baha'i faith and also among Persians as an icon of the women's movement. So Dr. Bahiyyih Nakhjavani, who is here with us, has a very interesting background herself, in addition to a very wonderful family. In short, she was born in Iran, but raised in Uganda, Africa, and has lived in the UK, the US, is a British citizen, but lives in France right now, and has worked in Canada, Cyprus, Israel, of course, Africa, and currently she's teaching English in Paris. So without taking more time, and without speaking more flowery about her, because she has several books and publications in French, in Persian, and in English, and of course translations into several languages. I will turn the floor to her and have her take the lead and actually speak of her art and her work. Thank you. Before we finish, I wanted to say her books are available, this book specifically, The Woman Who Read Too Much. It's available for sale at the end of the lecture. We have a wonderful lady back there who is going to be able to sell you copies, and the author, Dr. Nakhjavani, will be there to sign for you as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed for the honor of being here. Thank you, above all, to Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division, for this great privilege. Thank you, dear Hirad, the Iranian World Specialist. I'd like to also thank Mona Khademi for having arranged this. And most of all, thank all of you for having given up your lunch hour and not gone for Sizdah Bedar, which is my shame that I'm keeping you indoors for that. I hope we'll be able to throw off some of the old world ideas that we have in the course of the next 50 minutes, so that we will have done it symbolically at any rate. It's just a great privilege to be in this temple of books. I see Bill Collins here, whom I know from having worked in other temples of books. And I myself come from a city, forgive me, it wasn't quite Paris. It's on the other side of France, in Strasbourg, where we have a magnificent cathedral, which is known in the vernacular as Our Lady of Lace, because of the way it's been constructed to be almost transparent in stone. And it combines many extremes. It's got the Romanesque as well as Gothic architecture incorporated in it. It was briefly used during the Reformation for Protestant as well as Catholic Mass. And it has on the south-facing doors on each side, there is a figure of two women, one who symbolizes the Old Testament and the other who symbolizes the New. The Old Testament has this beautiful drooping head and broken lance, very poetic figure. The New Testament has a rather, forgive me, slightly priggish look on her face, but I'm sure she had good justification for it at the time. And it struck me every time I go to see this building that a cathedral, like a library, contains all the extremes, contains all the multiple ways of looking at the world. And I'm a great friend of and great admirer of Alberto Manguel, whom I'm sure you have heard of and maybe heard speaking on the subject of the importance of reading and the significance of libraries. And in one of his essays, he states that our books are accounts of our histories, our epiphanies, and our atrocities. Individually, humans can remember little. Even extraordinary feats of memory, such as that of Cyrus the Great, king of the Persians, who could call every soldier in his armies by name, are nothing compared to the volumes that fill libraries. In this sense, all literature is a testimonial. I had the great privilege of coming here last to this building about 25 years ago. It's almost a quarter of a century, I can't believe it, in order to do research on a work that was my testimonial to the figure of Qurratul Ain. And the last time I was here, and had the privilege of a reader's card and went into the stacks, it was in order to look up works about the early telegraph system in Iran in 1858 and the courier services that we used, because I had already begun the work that would culminate in the book, which I am very privileged to be able to share with you today. And this idea of stepping through the doors, going through the various barriers to enter this very wonderful building reminds me, of course, of the many stories that we have of the difficulty of entering the sacred space. Because in a world where, frankly, our sense of the sacred has been successively debunked and discredited and dismissed as irrelevant and even ridiculed, finally, worst of all, sentimentalized, I think libraries really are one place which is most sacred still in our culture. I hope it will stay that way for a long time. But I was reminded of the day when Virginia Woolf tried to get into the Bodleian. And in 1928, she was stopped, if you remember, by what she calls a guardian angel, who barred the way, a deprecating, silvery, kindly gentleman, she says, who regretted in a low voice, as he waved me back, that ladies are only admitted if accompanied by a fellow of the college or furnished with a letter of introduction. And then she goes on and she says that a famous library has been cursed by a woman is a matter of complete indifference to that library. Venerable and calm, with all its treasures safely locked, it sleeps complacently. About 60 years after that event, 60 years before that event, I beg your pardon, in America, we had another wonderful woman writer who described not the angel who barred the way, but her father, if you recall, in the famous letter of Emily Dickinson to Thomas Wentworth Higginson. She says, I have a brother and a sister. My mother doesn't care for thought, and father too busy with his briefs to notice what we do. He buys me many books, but begs me not to read them because he fears it joggles the mind. Now, we have, of course, this going back in history from the 20th century to the 19th with Emily Dickinson. I want to take you one further step back, and we go back to the early decades of the 19th century in Qajar, Iran, about 170, 80 years ago, to the city of Qazvin. And there we find this young woman, Tahirih Qurratul Ain, who comes from a family of clerics, very well known, all of them, mujtahids. Her great oldest patriarchal figure of the family, uncle, was the Imam Jum'ah of Qazvin. And in that town, you have this extraordinary contradiction of a young woman from Muslim background with this weight of ecclesiastic history and tradition behind her and around her, who is given a library of her own. Tahirih may have been not the only person who had a library of her own. The women in Qajar, Iran, who came from a courtly background were furnished with books, were able to read and write. My grandmother, whom we have mentioned today, was a woman who always had her finger on the pulse of the ordinary, and she used to whisper to me, you know, they were only taught to read, not to write, because they were allowed to read letters but not to write loved ones. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but certainly Qurratul Ain was unusual in having a library of her own. And I found myself thinking, what would have been in such a library of such a person at such a time? And obviously, manuscripts of Islamic jurisprudence, because she was a student at Karbala and Najaf and had studied the Quran and the Hadith and all the laws of jurisprudence. No doubt she had commentaries on the Hadith and the Islamic traditions. She had verses of the great Persian poets, Sa'di and Hafez, the mystic writings of Rumi. She was herself a poet, herself a great writer of verse, so doubtless she read it. And she must have also had the writings of Sheikh Ahmad Asai, who apparently had a conviction at that time that no reform, however drastic, within Islam could achieve its regeneration. And these extremely disturbing ideas, already in the very early years of the 19th century, caused a lot of debate in the family of Qurratul Ain. One uncle was very attracted to these ideas, the other one was strongly opposed to them, and so Qurratul Ain had in her own library some of the contradictions and extremes that I'm sure are contained here, and she was trying to reconcile all of them together. She also must have had copies written in her own hand of the writings of the Bab, Ali Muhammad the Bab, whose beliefs she espoused in those years. She would have had the Qayyumul Asma, she would have had, of course, his holy book, the Bayan. When I was writing this book of mine, I read everything I could in English about Tahirih Qurratul Ain. And those of you who know her history may have also seen a little photograph of her library, which was taken by a journalist from America who was traveling in Iran in the 1930s. Martha Root went to Qazvin, and she took a picture of what she described as a quaint artistic library on the second floor of the family home of the Baraghanis. And it shows rows and rows of ransacked, empty shelves. And I thought it would be helpful to understand from why it was that these shelves were empty. The ideas of Tahirih Qurratul Ain, as I already mentioned, were very controversial at that time. And it caused a feud and disruption in her family. And the writings of the Bab, whose beliefs she espoused, were very dangerous and were frequently destroyed, not only censored. In the description given by the great chronicler of the past as well as anticipator of the future of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi, he describes those writings of the Bab as being hurriedly transcribed, often corrupted, secretly circulated manuscripts, so furtively perused, so frequently effaced, they were washed, the ink was washed off the paper, and at times even eaten by the terrorized members of a proscribed sect. These were all dangerous evidence of heresy. My uncle, whom Hirad kindly mentioned in his introduction to this little book of some 60 poems of Tahirih, the only ones that in his estimation could be authentically identified as belonging to her, so many having been lost, so many reappropriated to others, describes her in the following words. He says, her short and tumultuous life, the beleaguered circumstances of the Babi community, the clandestine handling of Babi manuscripts, the scattering of her possessions, the hostility of her immediate family members who may have destroyed or suppressed her papers. All these mitigate against any sense of assurance that we now have access to all that she wrote. So it was extremely difficult to actually find original documents associated with Tahirih Qurratul Ain written by her. Since I wrote this book, Afsaneh Najmabadi, who has really dedicated her life to creating a unique collection online, a virtual library really, not only of books but of artifacts, objects, artworks, has gathered together in women's worlds in Qajar, Iran, many wonderful objects and documents, and there are online some of the writings of Qurratul Ain. I cannot say, because I am illiterate, whether they are tampered with or not. Who knows? It's an extremely difficult thing to write a testimonial, therefore, in the presence of so much absence. it's already awe-inspiring to be in the presence of all these books, but it's a great responsibility to stand before empty shelves. They remind us of how slowly and painstakingly our civilizations have been built. They remind us of how easily they can be cut down. And we don't have to look that far back to realize that for women, empty shelves are internal as well as external. That the library is not the physical building alone, but the memorial in the mind of all that has been read. And if women are denied that possibility of reading, then it's an emptiness that we have a responsibility for to future forever. I think that the world today is giving us many, many examples, heart-rending ones, most recently in Afghanistan, of young women who have been violated, abused, murdered because of their desire for education, their activities in coming and going even to university. The latest one in Turkey was coming back from university when she was attacked in the bus. And the young woman in Afghanistan, whose story just wrenches my heart, was attempting to reason with someone who was selling amulets outside the mosque, and to try and say to him, this is not in the Quran, the selling and buying of this kind of superstitious objects. So for a person to attempt to reason, to attempt to gain knowledge and share it, and be a woman is so difficult in many parts of the world. Alberto Manguel continues to say that all literature is civic action. So we're in the presence of an openness of society, not only openness of shelves. All literature is civil action because it is memory, and reading is reclaiming the right to this human immortality. So to erase that memory, to deny that immortality, not only by burning books, but by, unfortunately, in our days, the shoddiness of their production, the lack of their distribution, the limitations placed upon them by current market trends in publishing, all these are really violating our belief in the future as well as the past. I believe libraries protect the human rights of the dead. They're also a repository of hope for the living, and in that sense, no one could ever read too much. I want to give you, if possible, and hopefully I have the time, a brief synopsis of what I've done in this book. I've used the idea of reading as a metaphor to speak about reading the past, reading the future, and reading character. There's also a fourth element of the metaphor which involves the reader, and I'll get to that. Reading the past is, of course, very familiar to us. Retrospection is our instinct. In fact, it's the only direction we can really look clearly is behind us. And we can never really transport ourselves into that past. So we create constructs of it each time we have that retrospective form of reading. Again, since I come from that eastern borderlands of France, I just want to remind you that this is an area in which the frontiers were crossed multiple times, that you were allowed to speak in German, then you were had to speak in French, then you had to speak in German again, and back into French, so that at a certain point you ask yourself, which past do we have in this part of the world? Laird Boswell, who was one of the essayists in a collection called Perpetrators, Accomplices, and Victims, very interesting collection of essays on checkered frontiers such as this, writes that which past, he says, does one need to address and come to terms with? He's speaking specifically of Alsace. One of collaboration or accommodation, of courageous civil disobedience or of simple adaptation, one of implicit complicity or the courage of individuals who take the stand. Clearly, it is not an either-or proposition. And the kind of history I was looking at, in looking at the history of Tahirih Qurratul Ain, is also not an either-or proposition. There are too many extremes there. And so when I went back in my retrospective analysis, I had to find ways in which to look at this character from multiple points of view. And so I created women at the time, mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, within the Anderun, the four walls of that Anderun, symbolized by the four parts of my book: the book of the mother, the book of the wife, the book of the sister, and the book of the daughter. These are the four roles that we all inherit. Of course, not everybody turns out to be a mother, not everybody turns out to be a wife, not everybody has the good luck, or sometimes not good luck, of being a sister, but we're all daughters, and in the course of our lives, we know what it is to be part of that quadruple role-playing as women. So much for retrospective reading. But I couldn't write a story about Qurratul Ain without also playing with anticipatory reading, reading forwards. Of course, this is a little bit of a game with reading from right to left, from left to right. As a Persian and as an English mixture myself, I enjoyed the idea of weaving on the two sides of the page. But anticipation is something very close to the life of Qurratul Ain, because she was venerated as a prophetess. It was considered that she could read the future. And what that really meant was that she had enough intelligence to realize that every cause is going to have its consequence. So whether she was actually a seer, we don't know. But she would look and listen to people around her and say, watch out, if you do this, it's going to lead to that. And many times her words were taken literally from her mouth and condemned her for events that then took place, which she was then held responsible for. So I played with the idea of reading in the future by jumping in the timeline of this story and spanning 50 years in order to go ahead and look back. You must have all come across the wonderful writing of Hilary Mantel and the work that she has done on the Tudor period. Of course, the Tudor period is a giveaway. Everybody knows the story of Henry VIII and his various wives and who got their heads cut off and who managed to survive. But we do not know, generally, the general public do not know Qajar Iran as well as the Tudor period. I personally believe that one day the Qajar period is going to be our Tudor period, and there's going to be multiple. We're going to have another Folger library. We're going to have great writers who have written about it, because it's so rich with history, so full of paradox, so full of comedy as well as tragedy. And that idea of reading a past which at the moment we don't know, but one day we very much will, is part of the reason why I used anticipatory time in this book. I'll be brief because I don't want to use up too much time, but the third form of time that I used was a circling form of time. Because if you do go back and then you do come forward in your timeline of your plot, you ultimately end up circling. And I used the circling movement really because the more I thought about the figure of Tahirih Qurratul Ain, the more I realized that we had to sort of go around her in order to get closer and closer and closer to her. And maybe this is a very Persian thing to do, to circumambulate almost by respect, so that you don't just go in a direct, Occidental way of calling a spade and getting there. But I mean, we are of the Oriental people, we move in circles. Even in our language, we move in a circular fashion to say what we mean. And I was very much struck by the parallel also with satire number 3 of John Donne, if you remember, who describes that circling motion in a configuration very familiar to those of you who know Dante. He describes going round and round. Truth, he says, on a huge hill, cragged and steep, truth stands. And he that will reach her, about must go. And what the hill's suddenness resists, win so. Now, my movement going round and round was not going up towards paradise, it was going down. I won't say necessarily to the inferno, but it was the only way I could go down into the well where Tahirih's body was thrown at the end of her life, in order to go into that darkness, not only physical, but also 150 years of censorship and suppression and denial of who she was, took a circling motion. And as a result of that, I found the only way I could try to reach who she was by negative definitions, by defining her in a sort of rather scientific way, really, by what she was not. So the circling of character was another way that I approached time as well. Excuse me. Well, that brings me to the fourth way I looked at time, and that was the reader's role. Of course, a book doesn't exist unless it has readers. This is a banality to say in such a place as this. But reading a book is really a metaphor for reading oneself. The more you read, as Montaigne proved over and over again in his beautiful essays, the more you know yourself. The more you write, it's because you are reading yourself. So these things are very closely linked. And no words can have any meaning unless someone reads them. We need our gentle reader. Jeanette Winterson writes that in spite of its past, this book had not been finished. But finished by whom? The reader or the writer? So sometimes our participation in the act of reading is precisely what helps us understand what it's saying. So this challenge of time travel, which went backwards, forwards, and followed the linear plot of Tahirih Qurratul Ain in this story, where she was captured, brought to Tehran, and finally died across 3.5 years, involves also the circling and the negating of what she was not, in order to ensure that the reader is participating in that act, because it doesn't make sense unless the reader really engages in that. I think it's William Gaddis that said it's all about what happens on the page between the reader and the writing. What I want is a collaboration. And I wrote this book really to have some kind of a collaboration with you. And maybe one way I can describe that is to go back to the empty shelves. I'll just read a short passage here at the end of my story in which I describe the events that led to the escape of Tahirih Qurratul Ain from her own father's house. She had been confined in this house after a tragedy that happened in the family. I can't possibly give you a spoiler, so you have to find out what it was that happened. But it led to a feud within the family, a split in the society of Qazvin itself, and ultimately a catastrophe across the whole of Iran, whose tremors we still feel to this day. When she was incarcerated in her father's home, it was because on two occasions there had been attempts to poison her by the family members themselves. And this confinement was just killing her. And when she finally escaped, I will read you how her father felt about it. Now remember, this is a father unique at the time, who comes from a family of mujtahids, but whose awareness of the intelligence of his daughter is such that he insists that she get given the education of a boy. So in the 1830s, to have such an occurrence is extraordinary. His love for her was profound. His dismay with her actions and her words subsequently was equally profound. And I got myself into a real tiz because I just loved this father of hers. And I wrote a scene in which I imagined what he would have felt in a fictional form. How empty the library was after her going. Her father stayed in there, touching the spines of the books, caressing the pages she used to read to him. He lingered the whole day in there after her escape, murmuring, weeping. How he missed the sound of her voice, her chanting. How he deplored the silence in the Anderun. She had taken her pen case with her and her reeds, but it was only after several hours had passed that he noticed the gaps on the shelves. She had chosen carefully. She had selected only the most important to her, and the spaces where the books used to be mocked him, teased him with his ignorance of their titles. He had the impression that if he could only remember which ones she had chosen, he might be able to trace where she'd gone. But try as he might, he could not summon those texts to memory. He recalled their passionate arguments about them. He remembered why they had been so important to her, but the substance of the books, which were the pivot of their talks, eluded him. He realized that those gaps on the library shelves bore witness to his greatest loss of all, for without the knowledge of what had once lain on them, the mind, as well as the body of his beloved daughter, had slipped between his fingers. Well, if that enables us to get a little glimpse of why it's important to be a reader, to be able to read our own understanding of the text and to retain it so that when the substance of either the person or the writer or the book itself disappears, we can go on having that conversation, then I will have succeeded. And I think I should really come to an end here with one last little story to tell you about the importance of books in my book. And it's built on a story which we have inherited from history, which only has one source, so I cannot authenticate it, but it's the story recalled by the woman in whose house Tahirih Qurratul Ain was kept as a prisoner for these last 3.5 years of her life. And just before she was taken away to be killed, she gave this woman a bundle. Now, in the text that I have, which was probably in its original version, verbal, oral, spoken, said to X, repeated to Y, repeated to Z, and then finally written, who knows with how many mistakes, and then finally translated, the word used is package. And when I looked at that word, I said, no way was it a package, because a package means wrapped in paper, and there was no paper around to wrap anything in Qajar, Iran, in the middle of the 19th century. Paper was so valuable at that time. And what would it have been wrapped in? Cloth, obviously. And it was a bokche. And that also had 4 sides, so I was very pleased with the idea. You fold, you fold. And what do you put in a bokche of that kind? She gave it to the wife of the Kalantar, and she said, 3 days after they take me away, a woman will come to the door. Give this to her. Now we have the record of the wife of the Kalantar. She says, and 3 days afterwards, a woman did come to the door. And you can see that what she thought was important was the prediction, right? Fulfilled. We have no idea, history doesn't tell us, what was in that bundle. The wife of the mayor doesn't say anything about what was in that bundle. But then she says something very interesting. And it was because of what she said, or what I have heard through the echoes of history, retrospectively, of what she said, that I wrote this book. She said, the woman came to the door, just as predicted. I had never seen her before, and I never saw her again. And when I read that, I said to myself, so that is telling us a great deal about what was in the package. Because she clearly did not want to be known to have known who took it, nor did she ever want to know where it went. So she disclaimed all further contact with this person, and therefore what was in that bundle was very precious indeed. I don't know how many millions of books are in this library, but I think that just a small bundle of them would have been equally precious to Tahirih Qurratul Ain, and that they were both precious and dangerous, and therefore had to be denied. And it was such a powerful statement to me to deny the presence of books that I had to write one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, go ahead and sap Connie. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk and quite an amazing story. I'm looking forward to actually reading the book. I would love to open the floor up to about 3 or 4 questions. Feel free to ask any question. Go ahead.
Because I can only read and write
Could you say it again?
Yes.
We didn't hear.
Why?
Why did you decide to write the book in English? Every question just ask if you could say it.
To repeat it,
Yes, I would appreciate that. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm very limited in my capacity to read and write, so English is the language in which I do it. But the book has been translated into other languages. But unfortunately, I wouldn't have the ability to write it in Persian. That's why I pretend and do things backwards.
Thank you. I think it was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Did she have brothers? And was it, what happened? And if she did have brothers, did they also follow a literary
Bent. Yes,
Yes.
yeah. Did she have brothers? Tahirih Qurratul Ain had brothers, she had sisters, she had cousins. There were multiple in the family. I know for a fact, I can't answer about the brothers, but I know that one of her sisters did become a poet in her own right. This particular sister I have my eye on because I wonder whether she wasn't the recipient of the bundle. I don't know for sure, but she lived on. And she lived until 1896, which was the year of the assassination of Nasruddin Shah. There were others in her family who were deadly opposed to her, and their history I don't know so well. But I know a story about her daughter, which is interesting. I should add that it wasn't just the men in that family who were erudite. Within the family of Tahirih Qurratul Ain, already her mother was a great woman of letters. Her aunt was a calligrapher in the court of Fath Ali Shah. So she comes from a tradition of highly literate women. And her daughter, about whom there is some contradiction, in the more sentimental versions, she died of a broken heart soon after her mother was taken away. In other versions, she lived on to a ripe old age. She went back to Qazvin because apparently in her the last year of her life, she lived with Tahirih in the house of the Kalontar. She returned to her father's home, and she went on to become herself a teacher in one of the theological schools which the family had established there. So she was educating women too. What's fascinating is that there are traces all through the life of Tahirih Qurratul Ain that she had circles of women whom she taught to read and write. And it's ironic that her own daughter, who at the end of her life denied that her mother was a Babi, the only way she could resolve the contradictions for herself was to insist to the very end that she died a devout Muslim, in defiance of the facts. Nevertheless, she went on and did exactly what her mother had done and went on teaching women to read and write. Yes.
No, the reason I asked was, why was she chosen to receive a library?
Yes.
And this is why I asked if there were brothers, and if there were no brothers, then she would be the eldest daughter.
I think the reason was that she was brilliant. And that is what caused so much jealousy and controversy and tension within the family. She was given privileges nobody else was given, neither girl nor boy. And it caused the conflict in her marriage because she married her cousin. So, I mean, can you imagine being married to a woman like that? It was tough, you know. And I think she would have been resented by the girls in the family because she was allowed to study and not do the ordinary stuff. Yes, yes.
Go ahead, Joel.
Yes, thank you so much for illuminating Tahirih's life for us, because I'd never heard of her before. But I wonder how, I'm tying this with all three of your themes, the past, the future, the leader, how many Persian women at the time or even into today are familiar with her? Are they allowed to read about her?
Mm-hmm.
And will your book be translated into Persian?
This is such a good subject, really. I realized that in talking about time, I forgot the punchline. Can I give the punchline? When you've got a figure whose life is full of controversy, who's full of contradictions as she was, who is associated with a massive trauma, collective trauma, which takes place in society as a whole. There were some 20,000 people killed within a very short space of time during the lifetime of Tahirih Qurratul Ain, who were Barbies. So this has stayed like a shadow, like a stain in the minds of the Iranian people. And for many years, the very name of Tahirih Qurratul Ain was anathema. You could not utter her name. She was considered a prostitute. She was called, she couldn't initially be called a heretic, because you cannot kill a woman for apostasy, because that would admit to her having a soul and an independent mind. She could be misguided, but she couldn't be an apostate. So we see already the contradictions that she contained. So obviously, in the years of the 19th century and early 20th, right up till my childhood even, I can remember, it was not a subject that you would ever be able to talk about to the Iranians who were not familiar with her story as the Baha'is were. I come from a Baha'i family. I was raised with the knowledge of Tahirih Qurratul Ain. But most of the Iranians did not, unless they were very educated, unless they had studied and knew. But the common people were not so sure about who she was, or else had negative feelings about her, who she was. This is ironic too, because incredibly, it's not only her poems we should remember her for, not only her commentaries and treatises, but there were things she said which seem to have stayed in the popular memory. So, for example, when Gobineau was in Iran, and even later when Curzon was there, the statement that she made about the Kalantar, the master that you serve will one day betray you, she said, was still echoing in people's minds. The little poem that she apparently, not yet authenticated, responded to the invitation of Nasruddin Shah to become a concubine in his court. That little poem was also repeated, that wealth and power and honor are thine, exile and poverty, etc., are mine. You keep what is yours, I'll keep what is mine. This is people who didn't know really who Tahirih was. But in recent years, now this is very important, in recent years, since the revolution in Iran, the name of Qurratul Ain has become known. And I cannot leave this podium without mentioning the name of my, I don't know what to call her, she's my patron saint, Farzaneh Milani, who is in fact, we have a legacy here, because she was the student of my uncle. She did her doctorate under my uncle, Amin Banani. And he told me 25 years ago, you must meet Farzaneh Milani. And I did. And I got everything I could possibly get about Tahirih Qurratul Ain from her. Because she is a woman who, for the first time, really, in the history of letters in Iran, has put the name of Tahirih Qurratul Ain right up there as one of the founding mothers of modern Persian literature. So it's really since the revolution. It's because of people like Dr. Milani, who teaches at the University of Virginia, that the name of Tahirih Qurratul Ain has become commonplace now amongst the Iranians.
But also during the Green movement and what have you, she's become synonymous in many ways with both the freedom cause and also the women's movement. I mean, in Iran, Tahirih now, her poems and the women's movement have pretty much become, yeah. Go ahead.
How did you conduct your research? How did you reconstruct her life?
Well, I tried to explain how I reconstructed her life through negatives, first of all. And the way I did that was I looked up everything I could possibly find about her that I could get hold of. And then I saw all the contradictions. Some people call her consider her a saint. Other people consider her a whore. You've got everything in between. So then I had to find a way to reconcile that. And then I looked at the other women that I could find in Qajar, Iran at the time. So I found out everything I could about Mahd Awliya, the mother of the Shah, about Izzat Sultaneh, the sister of the Shah. I couldn't find out very much about Zaina, her daughter, except for the contradictions that I shared with you. But in order to try to understand her world, I had to look for other women at the time. And then I had to think of, okay, if she combined all these contradictions, and these were the other women at the time, what sort of woman was she? Why were they saying these things about her? I had to piece it together like that. I found what I could in the Baha'i literature, and I found also a great deal of useful material in the works of Abbas Amonat, in the work of Abbas Milani, in his book about the Shah. And I've put in the back of my, this is a novel, but it's actually got a bibliography in the back of it. It's also got a chronology of corpses. So although it's a work of fiction, I do not name anyone in this book. In the chronology of corpses, you can see the names of the actual historical figures who inspired the story. So that's why I need the collaboration of the reader, because you can piece together who is who and figure out, you know, what was going on. I also name all the men, of course, who were very significant both in this story and in her life, like Amir Kabir and so forth. Yeah.
Last question. خواهش میکنم. I'll translate. The young lady is referring to the fact that she's read about Qurratul Ain and her involvement in debates in Sheikh Ahmad Asari's, about his works and his writings and what have you. And she's asking our author here if there is any content in the novel about these debates.
Well, I wish very much that I had written a theological book. I didn't write about the actual contents of the debate, so that will disappoint you. However, I did describe her arguments with family members and also with others about the ideas behind the theories of Sheikh Ahmad Asai and also the Bab. One of the points that is shocking to her contemporaries is the idea of not only reform but renewal. The idea that a religion, like all great institutions, needs to be revived, needs to be renewed periodically, and therefore needs a spiritual impulse within it to have that happen. This was the most shocking. And this idea of change, the idea that you should change the way things were and have a new way, was one of the things that upset her contemporaries very much. In her own family, I have scenes where there is this debate going on about change. With her daughter, I have examples of it. In other places in the story, I have her with the women, and they are discussing with her, well, what do you mean by change? Is it you take your clothes off, but you're the same person? You put a new clothes on, it's a new dress, but you deep down haven't changed. So I try to find ways in which I translate some of the theology into something which is more appropriate to a story and which fits in with my narrative plot. I hope that answers your question.
Last but not least, she's become synonymous, Tahirih, with the unveiling. So many speak about her, about the woman, the first Persian woman to unveil in public. Could you say a word or two about that?
Yes, I'm so interested that you noticed I specifically didn't say anything about that.
That's why I brought it up.
Yes. Most people who know about Tahirih Qurratul Ain know one thing. They know that, and it always starts with a date. In 1848, in the remote province of Mazandaran, a woman walked into a public space occupied only by men with nothing at all on her face. Okay, that's basically what we know. And we don't take it much further than that. But that act of unveiling is itself something we have to read and reread and reread. And in history, interestingly enough, it has been reread in many different ways. It has been seen as an act of violent outrage against custom and orthodoxy and dignity and decency. So it's been symbolic of her being a prostitute, the fact that she took her veil off. It has been reclaimed much later by feminists as an act of emancipation of women, which wasn't her intention at all. Her intention was theological when she did that. She was making a statement about the end of the Sharia law. That's why she did it. She said, by taking my veil off, I will show them, not just by words, but by deeds, that we've come to a new stage of our development. And it's also been understood more symbolically as an act of unveiling the hypocrisies, the subterfuge, the manipulations, the lies, so that we are plain and truthful with each other. So she was also doing that. But I think that in the future that action will be replayed multiple times. And it's such an epic scene. It makes a legend of her. We don't really know how to understand it because it's so full of complexities. And so like all great myths, it has surrounded Tahirih and is sort of almost veiling her again. And one of the reasons I didn't use it was because I didn't want yet again to add, in fact, I have used it as hearsay, as rumor, which is the way we've understood her action. So I have all the women gossiping about what does it mean, and all the couriers coming and saying, oh, did she do that? No, she didn't do that, she did this. You know, so that we have all the different contradictory ways of understanding exactly what happened on that profoundly important occasion. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. The book is available right there. I really want to thank you for visiting us. I know she's only here for 2-3 days from France, so this is a huge honor. And thank you everyone for coming in the middle of your lunch break, especially Sis Davidar for the Persians in the house. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much. Really, thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.